All right, so in this recording, what we're going to do is kind of go over the basic usage of Packet Tracer. So to begin with, what we're going to do is just kind of loosely go through some of the main options that you'll be using for this class and any of the other classes that you'll be doing in the CCNA series. So with the way that I'm utilizing Zoom for this recording, just please make note of where the mouse is, because what I'll be doing is kind of pointing to specific things with the mouse so that you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. So if you've got the newer version of Packet Tracer or the older version, one way or the other, we can actually just go ahead and see which version I'm using here. This is actually the 7.1.1, so this is the older version. There is a newer version out there, which is the Packet Tracer 7.2. If you have the 7.2, some of the layout may look a little bit different, but the actual icons themselves are going to be relatively the same. You'll notice one big difference is that the selecting tool and deleting tool on the older version of Packet Tracer is actually located here on the right. With the newer version of Packet Tracer, they're kind of located up here at the same location as the menu bar for new and save. But other than that, they've added a couple of routers to the newer version and it functions better in Mac. So if you do have a Mac, please make sure that you get the newer version. And the other main thing is that if you're going from the logical view to the live view or the in some of uh, the simulation mode. In the older version, you actually, and in the newer version too, you can actually go based upon the view icon to go to simulation mode, real time mode. In the older version, you have the logical view, and then you actually have a physical topology view, so you can actually kind of design a city landscape in Packet Tracer. But without that, or now that we've gone over that, let's go over some of the basic functions that you'll need in the class. For the most part, you're only going to be going between three basic locations, which is going to be this first one down here at the bottom left, which is network devices. And of course, it holds your routers and your switches. Beside that is the end devices, which you're probably just going to stick with this main end devices location. And then the last one, of course, is this lightning bolt, which represents your actual connection cables that you'll be using. So for this example, what we're going to do is just basically kind of do similar to the layout that is in the classroom, where we actually have a router, a switch, and a PC that we're going to pull into the window and discuss. So first, what we're going to want to do is go over here to network devices, go to routers, which is kind of be your pretty much it's always going to default to routers. You'll actually have to click next to that to get the switches. But what we're going to do is we want to drag up one of these 1941 routers. Now, in the newer version, there is a newer router. Typically, with the packet tracer assignments, they'll tell you which version of the router that they want you to utilize. So I typically kind of default to this 1941. What you're going to do is click on that and drag it onto the screen and let it go. Once it's on the screen, you can actually single click the router name and you can change it to match the name that you're going to call the router. Now, one thing to note is that going into the CLI and actually changing the host name of the router does not change this name that's outside. So if you want your router's host name to match the name that you give the router, make sure that you actually do that physical naming out here. Pretty much, I would suggest before you go into the CLI and do it. It really doesn't matter one way or the other, but you would have more confusion if you had the outside name something different than the host name. And you'll actually see what I'm referring to here in just a second, because we're going to go into each individual little part, but I kind of want to keep this in order. So the next thing we're going to do is we're in routers. We're going to come over here to this next part where it says switches. Again, most packet tracer assignments will tell you exactly which switch that they're wanting you to use. In the newer version of Packet Tracer, there's still the 2960. It's kind of the standard right now. So you'll just click on that and drag it onto the screen. Yet again, change the outside name to be whatever you want it to be. Again, I recommend name it whatever you're going to make the host name so that they match. Now, finally, what we're going to do is come over here to End Devices at the top. Make sure that it's End Devices, which it typically defaults to down at the bottom. And then you're just going to want to pull a generic desktop onto the screen. Now, this desktop is going to not only act as our machine that we're going to be using for our testing, but in this scenario, we're actually going to use it to do configurations as well. In another class that I had, I did have a student that asked, well, Mr. McSwain, in a real business environment, wouldn't you take around a laptop that you would utilize to configure devices? And I said, sure, because in this scenario, you actually can pull a laptop onto the screen and you could do your consoling from this single device as if you were in a real business IT environment. And that's absolutely fine. My suggestion is that if your instructor says that that's okay, leave the laptop on the screen. Show them that that was the way that you configured each device was utilizing this scenario that would be more like from a business environment. Okay, so next thing we want to do is, because I said we're going to console from the actual PC, so we're not going to use this laptop. So this is a good opportunity to show you how to remove devices. Now, one thing to note is that if you just come over here and click the X, sometimes if you've got a device that you just put onto the screen, the first thing it's going to ask you is a yes or no question. Do you want to delete the last device that was active? I typically tell everybody, tell it no, because once you tell it no, then you've clicked on the X. But now realize that as long as that in the older version is a crosshair or a sideways crosshair like it is now, anything that I single click on, it is going to delete from the screen. Now in the version 7.2, it's actually going to look similar to like a backspace bar that's going to be up here in the top left corner. It'll kind of have like a arrow pointing to the left with an X in the center of it, but it does the same function. It's just the delete key. So what you want to do is once you get the crosshairs for what you're wanting to delete, choose the icon of the object you want to delete, left click, and now it's gone. Now, once you've deleted something or you deleted everything you want to get rid of, make sure to go back to the selection option, because if you don't, like I said, everything you left click on, it is going to delete. Okay, so now we've got our router, our switch, and our PC on the screen. So now it's time to cable them up. What we're going to do is in this top area, come over here to the lightning bolt, click on that. It's going to definitely default to our connections. So what we're looking at is a list of connection options that we have. Now, this option here that is the lightning bolt, it basically stands for automatically put the cable there that should be there. You can do that, but I like to tell people don't, strictly because you're learning. So it's not going to help you in the real world if you utilize a lightning bolt to just automatically put the right cable there, and then you get into a business environment and you have absolutely no idea what cable actually goes there, strictly because you've been utilizing the automatic feature the entire time you've been training yourself or doing these labs at home. So utilize the actual connections that you would use. So if you're going to use a console cable to go from a PC or a laptop to the devices to configure them, you're going to use a copper straight through cable for devices that are not the same. So a router to a switch to a PC. Now, if you are going from a router to a router or a switch, or even a PC to a router, you are going to want to use a crossover cable. And a crossover cable is for unlike devices. Okay, so that's when you're going to use that. If you have a fiber card set up into your router and into your switch, of course, you would utilize the fiber connection. You've got a phone connection for any of the other end devices or Internet of Things devices that are listed in Packet Tracer. We're not going to use those. You've got a coaxial for a coaxial modem. We're not going to use those in this particular class. And then, of course, you got the serial DCE, serial DTE, and then optical Internet of Things custom cable and a USB. Now, for this lesson, you're really only going to be using the console cable, the straight through cable, possibly a crossover cable, and then the serial cable, the DCE preferably. All right, so now that we figured out what cables we have listed here, we're going to cable up our router to our switch to our PC. Now, in this scenario, the only cable that is going between all three of these devices is going to be a copper straight through, and that is because they are not like devices. So what we're going to do is click on the cable. We'll come up here to the PC and cable it first and go from the fast Ethernet cable up to any port in the router, or any port in the switch, unless a specific port is given to you. If you are in CCNA 2 or CCNA 3 or any other environment that would tell you which specific port, use the port the lab tells you, because that's specifically, more than likely, what's going to happen is you are going to disable all other unused ports. So if you're utilizing a lab that gives you a specific port, use that port, because if you plug it into any old port and then the next line of the lab says shut down a range of ports and you're plugged into that range of ports, you're going to be killing your own connection. But if you're in CCNA 1 or in the first scenario of training, then pretty much any of these connections are going to be absolutely fine, because by default with a switch, all ports are defaulted to being open and on and in the default VLAN. So if they're all in the default VLAN, then they're all in the same VLAN. So you just simply choose a port you want to use. I'll just say Fast Ethernet 10, and then you've got a connection from your PC to your switch. Like I said, since the switch is defaulted into the VLAN 1, and it only recognizes MAC address because it is a layer 2 device, as you can see, even though we've configured no IP addresses on this PC, we're still in the process of establishing a connection, strictly because that port is turned on and it is now recognizing the MAC address of this PC's NIC. All right, so next what we're going to do is we're going to take a copper straight through again, and this time I'm going to go from the gigabit 01 port into the gigabit 01 port up here. Now, again, if you are in a lab that tells you a specific port to use that port, because if you just choose a random port and you either shut down the one that's not needed and you're plugged into one of those, or if you do a configuration on a router to a specific port and it's not the port you're plugged into, your configurations are not going to matter. Now, and as I was saying earlier, since this is a layer 2 device and it is by default on and the ports are up, this connection is established via MAC address. The reason that this connection here is still down is that because this is a router is a layer 3 device that needs an IP address, but it is still unable to communicate with this switch to establish a MAC address connection, because by default, all ports on a router are off or shut down. So you will have to turn those back on. Now, we're not going to do any configurations in this walkthrough. This is strictly how to use Packet Tracer, okay? Not to go ahead and do all of the establishing and everything, but just remember the reason that this is red is because the port that we're plugged into is shut down. All right, so now we're ready to get into configuring our devices. So what we would do is we would choose the console cable, come down here to PC, click on PC, and we're going to choose the RS-232 port. This is the same as saying the serial port, or the 9-pin connection that is on the back of some PCs. Now, some of your newer model PCs they're not really coming with too many of them, so you end up having to get a USB connection for a console adapter. But in this case, they do give you a RS-232 port which is a console or a COM port. So you click on the COM port. You'll notice that the console cable is kind of now following your mouse, so you can pick the device that you want to configure first. So if we want to configure our switch first, we would click on the switch. We would choose the console port on the switch and click on that. Now we have an established connection between the PC and the switch via the console port. Now, there are two ways in Packet Tracer to do configurations. The first and the main way is if you click on the PC, you're going to come in here and you're going to go to the tab that is called Desktop. This location is where the majority of the stuff that you're going to be working with is located. Either you're going to a web page, running a command prompt, connecting into a terminal to a switch or a router, or whether you're doing an IP configuration of the PC itself. Now, I will tell you one tip. If you're doing the IP configuration of the PC, my suggestion is after you configure the IP address of the PC, you'll notice how if I hit tab down, it gives me the default subnet mask for the class of the IP address based upon the first number. So since this is a class C, it is of course 255.255.255.0. Now if I were to delete this and make this 172 and then hit tab, now you can see it actually defaults to a class B subnet mask. So please be aware of that, because if you're told to make everything a specific class subnet mask, if it does not default to that, make sure that you change it so that it does match. Now, another thing that I also recommend is that after you get done configuring your default gateway, hit tab again until it highlights the DNS server. Now, you may not have to enter in a DNS server. The lab may not even ask for a DNS server. But I have noticed in the past that there has been situations where Packet Tracer has dropped the configuration of the static configuration of a PC, and you don't want to be kicking that in with troubleshooting. And I've noticed that you can kind of bypass that issue if you just hit tab and highlight the DNS server before you hit the X up here in the blue bar. Now, the next thing that we're going into is terminal. So if you're in a classroom and you're using something like TeraTerm, just remember term is terminal. So what we're going to do is come over here to terminal and click on it. We're definitely going to keep the defaults because we want it at a 9600 with an 8-bit, and then the rest of this stuff is perfectly fine. So we're going to click OK, and now you're going to see that we're inside the switch. Now, I'm going to kind of click out of here, and I'm going to show you the secondary way of configuring a switch. And then the other way of configuring the switch is by clicking on the switch itself, and you'll notice that up here there is a tab that says CLI, which is Command Line Interface. So if you click that, I'm going to slide this over here to the side so that I can pull in from my other screen. You'll see here, though, that they're exactly the same. This is the PC using the console cable and a terminal connection, and then this is the CLI interface on the switch itself. Now, this is where I told you make sure that you name the device what you're going to call it, because if you'll notice, the only difference between these two right now, other than this blue bar, is the fact that this says PC1 and this says Switch1. So that's why I was saying make sure that whatever name you put outside of the switch is, or the device, matches what you're wanting to see up here in the window. Now, what you'll notice is that whatever I type into one window will appear in the other window. So either option is perfectly fine for configuring them in the introductory stages of using Packet Tracer. Now, as the semesters go on, or as you keep going into different labs and certain labs that you don't start from scratch, you will notice that some devices that the CLI or the actual configuration window of the device is completely locked down. If that's the case, then you have to use the PCI console connection method So I always recommend use this method anyway because it just keeps you in the habit of utilizing that console cable and going from a PC to the device you need to get to. Now, with that being the connection method that we've got established, I'm going to pull this over. And now what we're going to do is I'm going to show you how let's say we've gotten done with our configuration of our switch. We're completely done. It's ready to go. So then we're going to come up here and you're going to see this circle right here that's on the console cable. What you're going to want to do is click in the center of that circle. And now, if you'll notice, if you're holding down the left mouse button, that again, the console cable is following your mouse. So now all you got to do is just drag that up to the router, click the router again, like let go of the left mouse button and then click it, and then choose console. I'm going to pull back over the console connection. Now, if you can see here, the terminal screen's kind of hazed out. It's not working. And that's because we're connected into another device. So what we're going to do is hit the X up here in the blue and go back into terminal. Choose our defaults again and click OK. And now, as you can see, we're in the router. So we definitely want to tell it we don't want it to help us out with initial configuration, but you can see now that we're in the router. Now, I want y'all to see this. We're not going to go into a full in-depth configuration of it, but if I go into enable, config terminal, and then say interface G01, and then say no shut, now you can see that our connection has come up. If you're using the newer version of Packet Tracer, these are not circles, they're actually triangles, but that's really the only cosmetic difference between what you'd be seeing on my screen versus what you would see on your screen. But as you can see, just by turning on that port, we're now establishing a connection. So now that we've kind of gone through the basics of how to connect to the devices so that you can get in and configure them, that's your basic layout of Packet Tracer that you would need for your introductory CCNA classes and how to get started. I will be making other videos as far as going more in depth to the configurations of the switches and the routers. Then again, and yet again, please note that this is strictly a video for how to connect to them to get started. I hope you found this video entertaining and informative, and I look forward to talking to you again.